Lecture 29, The Romance of the Rose.
Welcome once again to our series of lectures on the literatures of Europe's Middle Ages. In this, our fifth lecture, we'll turn to the greatest of all the medieval romances, the 13th century Romance of the Rose. Now, we've already been introduced to the genre of romance, so we needn't rehearse the basic details in turning to the Romance of the Rose, which is, unlike the 12th century works we've considered before, a titanic work in size. Now, fair enough, Tristan and Isolde, is a very long poem, but most of those, for instance, of Chrétien de Troyes are relatively shorter. This is a poem of about 21,700 lines. It's written by two authors who worked about 40 years apart. Guillaume de Lorris wrote about 4,000 lines in about 1237. We know virtually nothing about him. He is named, but not described, by the second author. Now, the second author, Jean Chopinel, or Clopinel, better known as Jean de Meung, says that 40 years later he continued the poem, so presumably sometime in the 1270s. So he did. He added more than 17,000 additional lines. Of him, we know that he was a sophisticated intellectual. We'll have plenty of indications of that as we go along here. He was probably a teacher in Paris, where perhaps Europe's greatest schools were then to be found. We know that he translated into French the Latin work of Vegetius on the art of war, and also Boethius's Latin Consolation of Philosophy. That's a book that had very considerable influence in the 13th and 14th centuries. We're going to bump into it several times in this lecture and in our next several lectures. Now, the Romance of the Rose enjoyed unprecedented popularity in the Middle Ages. Remember, we talked about Beowulf, one manuscript, Roland, one manuscript, El Cid, one manuscript. Nearly 300 manuscripts of the Romance of the Rose survive, and many of these are lavishly illustrated. In other words, they were very expensive luxury books. Chaucer translated a portion of the Romance of the Rose into English. We'll have occasion when we come to Chaucer to talk about its influences on him. There was a German translation, too. Now, there's something slightly enigmatic about this evident popularity of the Romance of the Rose. It is long, it is complex, and truthfully, it's a difficult work. Jean Gerson, who was the chancellor of the University of Paris and a major theologian at the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, called the Romance of the Rose a work of chaos and Babylonian confusion. The great Columbia scholar Gilbert Hyatt spoke of its shapeless garrulity. Well, fair enough, but the Romance of the Rose is also surpassingly beautiful. It's utterly ingenious, and it's infinitely fascinating. It simply takes patience to come to grips with it. Now, the Romance of the Rose is a sustained allegory. This accounts for both its difficulty and its interest. Allegory itself had two distinct kinds of meanings in the Middle Ages. One, the second, to which I'll turn in a second, more prominent than the first. In ancient rhetoric, and medieval authors knew this, from Aristotle to Quintilian, allegory meant more or less a sustained metaphor. Well, medieval writers knew that, but they also derived from the Church Fathers, from Augustine and Jerome and Ambrose and so forth, an allegorical mode of reading the Bible. Put in simplest terms, what you see on the page may not convey, may not exhaust, probably does not exhaust all the meaning. In other words, allegory is a trope through which one understands one thing by means of another, or that words mean something different from what they appear to say. Part of the difficulty and of the interest of reading the Romance of the Rose rests in its continuous use of personification, where various names, and we're going to turn to them in just a minute, are assigned to abstractions. We never actually have the sense in the Romance of the Rose that we're reading about anybody in particular. Perhaps indeed we're reading about everybody, or perhaps the level of extractions takes us past all the bodies together. Now, it's perfectly true that personifications were common in classical literature, and classical literature influenced the Romance decisively. the kind of personification in the Romance of the Rose, where various qualities are set off in opposition to one another, reach back to the poet, most directly to the poet Prudentius, who was a contemporary of St. Augustine, late 4th, early 5th century. He wrote a long poem called the Psychomachia. Now, the Psychomachia was a battle for the soul. It was a treatise on virtues and vices, where the virtues and the vices, as it were, slugged it out. This laid the groundwork for a long series, centuries-long series of treatises in Latin on the virtues and the vices. And we can see a great deal of this reflected in the Romance of the Rose. Now, let's try to summarize the remarkable poem of Guillaume and Jean before turning then in the end to some reflections on its sources, on its devices, on its themes, and on some of its meanings. Let's begin with Guillaume's story. You'll recall that perhaps about 1237 he produced a poem of about 4,000 lines. A young man, lover. He's not named. He's not a sort of fully flesh and blood human being. So a young man, lover, who is 20, just the right age for love, we are told, falls asleep in May, just the right time for love, we are told, and has a dream. The Romance of the Rose, in which Lover says is contained the entire art of love, is his account of that dream. Well, Lover, the main character, goes for a walk. He's in a dream now. He goes for a walk along a stream, and he comes upon a beautiful garden. Now, this beautiful garden is surrounded by a wall on which there are 10 images painted in gold and azure, the very symbol of luxury. They depict hate, cruelty, baseness, covetousness, avarice, envy, sorrow, old age, religious hypocrisy, and poverty. Lover looks and looks and looks for an entrance to the garden, and he finally finds a very small door through which idleness admits him. Now, Lover enters the garden, and he finds a lovely band of people dancing and singing and enjoying music. Idleness, it turns out, is the friend of pleasure. Pleasure owns the garden and presides over all the merriment. Many other characters are introduced as well. At the conclusion of the dance, the lovers all went into the woods to disport themselves. Sexual innuendo is everywhere in this poem. And Lover began to explore the garden. Cupid follows him at a discreet distance. Lover then comes upon the spring of Narcissus. Again, an allusion to the myth of Narcissus, and another allusion to classical literature. And he sees 2 crystals in a pool. They each reflect half the garden. Looking into one, Lover sees a reflection of a rose garden, in the midst of which is a particularly beautiful rose, which the lover immediately and ardently wishes to pluck. Cupid then unleashes 5 arrows: beauty, simplicity, courtesy, company, and fair seeming, which wounded Lover. Now, he was shot in the eye by these arrows. It didn't blind him. In medieval theory, the eye was the path to the heart. So Cupid shoots 5 arrows into Lover and intensifies his already burning desire for the rose. Lover then becomes Cupid's vassal and promises to serve him faithfully. So you see some of these conventions that we saw in 12th century romance where one almost has a play on feudalism. Lovers become vassals of the ladies that they love and wish to serve and so on. Well, Cupid hopes that Lover will not betray him, as so many have done before. Well, indeed, there have been many betrayed lovers, but also we have this kind of curious vassalic relationship now, and obviously there have been many lords betrayed by their vassals. Lover asks Cupid for instruction on how he might serve faithfully. Now, here we get, remember the poet tells us the entire art of love is contained here. Here we get almost the classic statement of the courtly lover. So Cupid tells Lover, who has asked for some instruction, to abandon baseness, to avoid slander, to be brave yet approachable, never be coarse, serve and honor all women, labor in women's service, eschew pride, bear himself elegantly, wear fine clothes and shoes, be always well groomed, be blithe, care for joy and pleasure, be agile and athletic, be an accomplished horseman, play musical instruments, dance, be generous. Above all, he should fix his thoughts on love and be prepared to bear all the torments of love, and understand, finally, that the object of his desires may be unattainable. So there we have, if one ever wanted to see it laid out, there is the classic medieval romance statement of what the lover, the ideal lover, is supposed to be. Ideal lover. Cupid departs, and lover contemplates entering among the roses, penetrating them, we read. Fair Welcome bids him enter. Now it turns out, of course, there's a detestable villain, Rebuff, who is guarding the roses, and he's assisted, this is rather interesting, by Evil Tongue, Shame, and Fear. Evil Tongue, bad stories. Shame, what the lover may feel at what he's about to do. Fear, the sentiment that he may feel as he is about to approach his love. Lover tells Fair Welcome that he must have the rose, but Fair Welcome tells him that will be impossible. Rebuff scares off Fair Welcome. Reason descends from her tower, tells lover it was unfortunate he entered the garden, and urges him to abandon love. She tells him all about those who guard the roses and say that love makes men incapable of doing anything else. They just can't help themselves, but they really should think about it. Lover tells her that Cupid will not release him from his bond of vassalage. Lover now turns to Friend. Friend gives him advice, especially telling him to befriend Rebuff. Now Rebuff is somewhat mollified by Lover's eloquence, but still forbade him to cross the hedge and approach the roses. Cupid then sends generosity of spirit and piety to Rebuff to entreat him. Finally, Rebuff permits Fair Welcome to return. Fair Welcome leads lover to the rose, which he wants to kiss, but chastity forbids it. Venus now comes to lover's aid. Fair Welcome finally accords lover the gift of a single kiss. The kiss having, as it were, made the affair public, Evil Tongue now turns jealousy against Fair Welcome. Fear, meanwhile, criticizes Rebuff for not being more vigilant, for not keeping lover away from the rose. Jealousy then builds walls and moats guarded by a tower around the roses. Rebuff, Shame, Fear, and Evil Tongue guard the four gates and imprison Fair Welcome. Lover despairs because his only hope of attaining his rose is for Fair Welcome to escape. Guillaume ends his story here. Evidently unfinished. Now, perhaps he died. Perhaps, remember we talked about this in connection with Gottfried von Strassburg? Perhaps he couldn't actually finish the story. He couldn't resolve the dilemma he had created. If you stop and think about it, we've got the roses inside this new wall, guarded by a tower, guarded by four formidable sentinels, and lover is on the outside despairing, and he can't figure out what he's going to do. So, obviously, Guillaume de Lorris had put him in a rather difficult spot. At this point, Jean de Meun took over. Now, it seems, in one way, that he did so rather seamlessly. The same characters are present, a few new ones are introduced, but his portion of the poem is more than 4 times longer than Guillaume's. Now, because of that, we have to summarize it in relative terms a bit more briefly than we did the first part. Fortunately for us, Jean organized his long section into a series of great scenes, and each of these scenes, or, well, not each of them, but most of them, are marked by very long speeches. In a few cases, several thousand lines long these speeches were. Clearly, they are little treatises for the delight and edification of the reader. Well, lover resigns himself to serving Cupid and taking what comes. Reason hears his lament and comes down from her tower, yet again. She had already done this once in Guillaume's section. She comes down again. Now, she delivers a speech of more than 3,000 lines. In other words, we've got a speech here about the length of Beowulf, or 3/4 of the length of Roland. A very long speech, very typical of Jean de Meun's section of The Romance of the Rose. Reason tells lover of all love's contradictions. She calls it a mental illness. A mental illness. Doesn't hold it up to high ideals and lofty ideals and make it something pure and wonderful. No, it's a mental illness. Now, this is reason talking. She makes 3 requests of lover. First, that he love her. Now, she isn't really described for us. I mean, we don't know if she's beautiful or not. We don't know if she's appealing or not. She is reason. So, love her. Spurn Cupid. That was her second request. And third, attach no value to fortune. Now, fortune is an issue that runs through the romances generally, and we're going to see fortune turn up in Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio and Chaucer, authors that we'll consider in later lectures. What we meet here really is a kind of a debate on the idea that things may not be going so well now, but they'll get better. Or if things are really going great, they may turn around and get worse. Well, fortune, she says, is something you should abandon. Fulfilling the first request, she says, moreover, will free him from the other 2. In other words, if he loves reason, he actually won't even have to go on to these other requests. Well, having listened, lover says he must serve his master, and not for anything would I exchange the rose for you. Now this, in some sense, of course, is precisely a confirmation of the idea that love is itself a mental illness. Reason then turns, it's almost amusing in a way, to a quite graphic description of the sexual organs, and tells lover that even animals have them. Lover says she is crude, and she returns to her tower. He's much too idealistic for this kind of talk. But she's clearly, in some sense, saying that sex is something even animals can do, and for heaven's sakes, you ought to be about something higher, something loftier than that. Now friend appears and tells him that fair welcome will be released. We're going to see it takes a while for that to happen. And he offers some advice. Friend advises lover to be discreet, to flatter the gatekeepers, to ingratiate himself, give gifts at every opportunity, but don't turn largesse into, another of the personifications, unrestrained generosity and wind up poor. Friend says that being handsome is not enough, and lover needs to cultivate intelligence. Now, bear in mind Guillaume de Larisse's long, wonderful description of the ideal lover, you see, and intelligence, but intelligence manifested in particular kinds of skills, was central to that description. What Jean puts in the mouth of Friend here is something a little bit different. He says that the kind of intelligence, for instance, that permits one to write poetry is not what is needed here. Rather, something more like deviousness, deceit, cleverness, duplicity. That's what is needed. Friend also then goes on in a rather interesting way to say that in olden times, refinements and cleverness were not necessary. Presumably, in other words, that love, read sex, was much more easily and freely available. Now, if you want love and sex, you've got to go through all of these steps in order to get there. Friend then concludes with a quite remarkable tirade against marriage. Now that again is one of these kinds of courtly conventions that we saw we talked about in connection with 12th century romances, that there cannot be true love inside marriage. So Friend sort of lays out that point of view for us. Cupid reappears. Now first of all, he criticizes lover for even listening to reason, and he demands 10 commandments of love as a penance. Then he assembles his barons for an attack on the castle where the rose and fair welcome have been imprisoned. Well, the allies approach the castle and speak with Old Woman. Now, Old Woman guards fair welcome. We may, when we come to Chaucer and we think about his wife of Bath, be reminded of the Old Woman. She offers her own views on love, saying that a woman should never trust one man, and that women must seek to regain their freedom. Like Friend, she advises deceit and dissembling, but in the end, she grants access to fair welcome. Fair welcome permits lover to approach the rose, but once again rebuff intervenes. Meanwhile, the battle continues before the castle, and Cupid cannot prevail. So he calls upon Venus. As the battle continues, nature appears. Nature delivers a remarkable speech, saying that art, meaning human skill, cannot match her. So we have here a wonderful play on human inventiveness on the one hand and nature, the natural world, the natural order of things on the other hand. And she goes on to say that free will and divine providence are not incompatible. In other words, nature turns to a series of theological propositions. One wouldn't necessarily have expected that. She counsels against dreams and frenzies. This is quite remarkable when we bear in mind that we are here in a dream world. This whole poem is a dream. We're in a dream, and then nature, in the middle of the dream, criticizes dreams and frenzies. She also says, and we've met this before, haven't we, that nobility is a matter of character and not of birth. Well, it's natural that nature would say that, isn't it? Nature concludes that the ancients didn't know of Christ and moderns are unworthy of his sacrifice. Perhaps the lesson there is that, on the one hand, you ought to give up all of this interest and fascination with classical literature and all of this amoral and immoral stuff that you find in classical literature and turn to Christianity. Well, fair enough, but this poem has not been particularly Christian up to this point. Nature also argues that free will has been abused to evade procreative sexuality, a position with which genius, who enters now, agrees, as had reason already. In Guillaume's section, the old woman, rather like Friend, had argued for love as instinctive and gratifying. Cupid then dresses genius as a bishop, and genius now preaches to the barons on love, to the barons of love who, with Cupid, are besieging the castle. So genius now preaches to them on hell and paradise. Again, not what one would have thought was uppermost in their minds. Relates the ages of man through the world from the creation until the last judgment, and describes the current age of iron and age of sin. Well, aided by Venus, who likewise indulges in dishonesty, the barons finally take the castle. The castle falls. Fair Welcome gives lover access to his rose, which he embraces, sexually, to be sure. The story appears to end happily. Now let's see if we can capture a sense of the sources, the devices, the theme, the meanings of this spectacular, enigmatic, and by-authored poem. The sources are actually fairly easy to identify. Guillaume knew a few classical authors, he knew some contemporary philosophers and theologians, and he certainly knew the great 12th century romances. He doesn't quote any of them, but his allusions are pretty easy to pick up. Jean, on the other hand, had a wide knowledge of classical texts, and he weaves them artfully into his narration and also into his speeches. He displays an intimate familiarity with contemporary writers of philosophy and theology, hence the suggestion that he may very well have been a teacher in the schools of Paris. Now, citing the classics for authors in the 13th century was, on the one hand, a way of showing off. You just displayed your learning, put it on show for all to see. But it was also a way of claiming authority. It was a very interesting way of claiming authority. You don't have to take this on my say-so. You take this because Ovid or Cicero or whom you please already said this. And those figures were of great authority, great influence in the Middle Ages. Now, as a contextual matter, one of the things that is quite interesting about the Romance of the Rose is that it is a wonderful indicator of, it's wonderful testimony to, the quickening pace of intellectual life in 13th century Europe. These guys quite simply knew a lot more, had read a lot more, had access to a lot more texts than authors before them for quite a while had had. Now, because the poem is cast as a dream, an old trick in literature, of course, the authors can disclaim any direct responsibility for it. The multiple voices. We have personifications speaking to personifications about other personifications, commenting on things that other personifications said, debates among the personifications, commented on by yet another of the personifications. These multiple voices put every point and seeming argument well beyond the authors themselves. We don't know what they think. We don't know what they want us to think. The veils behind veils behind veils behind veils are quite fascinating here. Now, Guillaume writes in the Ovidian tradition of the art of love, although Jean's embrace of deception comes from Ovid too. Both authors keep faith with, Guillaume more so than Jean, the 12th century romances, and even the 12th century theoreticians of romance, such as Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the Chaplain, who wrote An Art of Love in Latin in the 12th century. Jean writes like a scholastic theologian. He gives us, in effect, a summa of love. Again, a hint that he is perhaps familiar with the techniques, the methods, the intellectual interests of the Parisian schools. Now, the themes that one can elicit from this poem are so many that we couldn't hope to enumerate them all here, but we can perhaps single out just a few. Clearly, the poem is about the conventions of courtly love. Now, what I mean by that is not that it, in a sense, is courtly in and of itself. It is a running commentary on the conventions of courtly love. Where love is concerned, the poem, at the very least, seems to try to work out, to set in contrast to one another, perhaps in dialogue with one another, themes of love as something pure and idyllic on the one hand, and love as something sexual and protean on the other hand. The poem certainly seems to be saying something about the inherent contradictions between courtly love and Christianity, although those contradictions are much more visible, much more present in Jean de Meun's section than they are in the section written by Guillaume de Lorris. The poem is about women in some fundamental way. A lot of its most powerful and interesting characters are women. But it's a little difficult to say what the authors are trying to tell us. Readers can find many different positions, can adopt many different positions, can offer many different interpretations on the way the poem treats women. What does the poem mean? Well, suffice it to say that among critics there is absolutely no consensus. This poem is simply so long, so big, and so complex that many, many readings are possible. Guillaume, for example, appears to uphold the conventions of courtly love. Let me just repeat again the emphasis that I laid on his description of the ideal lover. But Jean appears to subject the conventions of courtly love to relentless criticism. What exactly are we to make of the amoral guile and deceit that mark so much of Jean's section? Are we to take this seriously? Are we to take it as ironic? Is it itself a running commentary on the amorality and immorality of what otherwise appears to be at the very heart of the poem? And bear in mind here that we have a kind of an interesting contrast on the one hand between love and reason, cast in a somewhat secular mode, and then we have a rather interesting discussion, a debate, if you will, contrast, if you will, between love and nature, where nature seems to speak most vividly for Christian values. And then we have genius coming and giving this speech on heaven and hell. Is the poem misogynist? Anti-feminist speeches are clearly put into the mouths of many characters, not least Friend. But many of the poem's most powerful figures, reason, old woman, nature, Venus, are women. And yet, for instance, just to contrast for a moment, nature and Venus. Which of these, for instance, does the poet want us to say, yes, right, that's what I should think, that's right, I agree with her? Well, very hard to say. The poem severely criticizes marriage. Friend, for example, delivers a diatribe against marriage. Cupid hasn't got much time for marriage. Yet praises procreative sexuality within a marriage bond. What are we to make of Genius's sermon on Christ's sacrifice and human sin? Is the poem really a condemnation of amoral sexuality? Perhaps. Perhaps. Does the poem actually, in the end, come down by defending and upholding marriage against all of this courtly love sort of relationship. Some believe the poem has a homophobic tinge. Cupid, for example, speaks explicitly against homosexuality. He says only men and women can truly love. And the stress on procreative sexuality may tend in the same direction. Now, has any kind of licit sexuality outside marriage actually been proscribed here? You see, if we were making an outline, what's the Roman numeral and what are the little letters? Well, we could go on and on and on. It is not surprising, perhaps, that this was the greatest of medieval romances and the most enigmatic, and it will lead us to the greatest of medieval authors, Dante Alighieri.